recognizes Ms. Rose to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, we've talked a lot about disproportionate negative impact and the changes that voter suppression measures have on our state's minority communities. So I think it's important that we track how these communities are affected by the decisions that we make in this body. This amendment will require the Secretary of State to conduct a study each biennium to determine the impact of the updates and that this legislature makes on the election code and has a different racial that it has on different racial and ethnic groups. So the study will be delivered to the members of the legislature ahead of publication. This study would also include an opinion on whether or not these changes made during the previous session had a disparate impact on any racial or ethnic groups. I move adoption.
Mr. Speaker.
Ms. Turner, for what purpose?
Would the gentlelady yield for a question?
Would the lady yield for questions?
Yes, I will yield for a question, gladly.
Thank you, Representative Rose. So your amendment simply will require the Secretary of State to conduct a study each biennium of the impact of different provisions of the election code with respect to different racial and ethnic groups. Is that right?
That's correct.
And this is something that you probably heard I've asked the bill author about on his layout. If the bill contains such a provision, he said it did not. So your amendment is an opportunity to correct that omission and put that in the bill. Is that right? That is correct.
That is what I'm trying to do here today.
And in fact, the perfecting amendment, to use Mr. Murr's description of the amendment that he offered and is now on the bill, actually does include a study in it, which is, I think, a good provision. Relates to studying certain impacts of the bill as it relates to Texans with disabilities. But there's not a provision in that amendment or in the underlying bill as it relates to the impact of this legislation or other legislation on racial minorities. And this is an opportunity to correct that and let the legislature learn if, in fact, these provisions are, in fact, have a disparate impact or discriminatory impact on minority Texans. Is that right?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
And we've heard testimony with respect to drive-through voting or 24-hour voting that that expanded early voting access was disproportionately used and taken advantage of by residents of Harris County who are voters of color. And so that might be an example where banning those conveniences would, in fact, have a disparate racial impact. Is that right?
That's a perfect example.
Okay. Thank you, Representative Rose. You have a good amendment.
Thank you. I move adoption. Or does the
The chair recognizes Mr. Murr to speak in opposition to the amendment.
Mr. Speaker, member, while I certainly respect Representative Rose and she makes an impassioned argument for providing additional information and studies, this topic has been discussed numerous times in our committee hearings that we had regarding this legislation, and so I would simply oppose the amendment.
The chair recognizes Ms. Rose to close on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I think on every issue that we talk about in this chamber, you know, it's easy to say what may not need to be happening if you've never been impacted by it. And that's what's wrong with this chamber. Texas is not a one-size-fits-all state. And a lot of times things happen in certain communities that just because it doesn't happen in your community doesn't mean it will not happen in another community. And one of the things that I'm really concerned about, when this bill was first laid out during the first special session, what was stated was the fact that we're not going to accept any amendments in the committee hearing, but when we get to the floor, we will allow amendments. And I just think it's so disingenuous that every amendment that a Democrat has brought to this table today, now I know you all just accepted Representative Busey's amendment, but the fact that you all have just already made a clear choice is so disingenuous to me for you to make those comments and you have no intentions on trying to work with your colleagues, and then you wonder why someone takes the position that they take. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I move adoption.
Ms. Gonzalez, for what purpose?
Does the gentlelady yield?
Yes, I will yield.
She yields for questions.
Thank you, Representative Rose. There was hundreds of hours of testimony, correct?
Hundreds.
And multiple communities came out and said there will be a negative impact, correct?
Yes.
And so all you're trying to say is that if we hear those voices and we still want to move forward with this legislation, let's at least study it. So if we are genuine and sincere about wanting to say we don't want to impact these communities, the least we could do is do a study.
Exactly. When we say God bless Texas, that we're talking about everyone in Texas, but apparently when they say God bless Texas, I don't know if they mean every Texan, because it's only certain groups that always get to have get to provide the needs that they need for their communities, and not all communities.
Because if we were sincere, we would want to know if there were any negative implications so we could fix it if that's really what we are saying on the floor today.
As you stated, folks stood in line, folks stayed in the committee hearing for over 24 hours to let their voices be heard. And what we're saying in this body, your voice does not matter.
Thank you so much, Representative Rose. You have a great amendment.
Thank you.
The question occurs on adoption of the amendment. There's a record vote requested by Mr. Turner of Tarrant. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Ms. Rose voting aye. Show Ms. Click voting nay. Have all members voted? There being 41 ayes and 78 nays, the amendment fails to adopt.